This happened in 2004 in rural Virginia. I was 12 years old at the time and out deer hunting with my dad and his brother Rick. I was never really into hunting like my dad was, but I sometimes found it cool and I wanted to make my dad happy. My dad says it's a useful sport to start learning, especially for someone at a young age like myself. I didn't really get the thrill of it though. Ending the life of a living, breathing animal that has just as much of a will to live as us didn't sound amusing at all. My dad would always lecture me about how hunting isn't about the killing of an animal, but a vital wildlife management tool to keep nature at a healthy balance. Whatever that meant, I still didn't find it fun for a sport. However, I did enjoy spending time with my dad, so I always went with him. I remember this day like it was yesterday, and although I can't remember all of the details, this story is 100% horrifying. It was the middle of fall, meaning it was the peak of deer hunting season in Virginia, which also meant big game for the hunters. Both my dad and Rick were on the hunt for both deer and elk while I sort of just shadowed them to learn the aspects about hunting. It was around 5 in the morning, which was apparently the best time to find elk walking around. I remember the three of us walking down a trail to try and look for game, but were unable to find any. By this point, it was the crack of dawn, and my dad had recommended we use the deer hunting tower that was deeper into the woods. It was maybe about a 10-minute walk, and so we did just that and made our way over to the hunting tower. The tower wasn't anything too big. It was just a tower small enough for a group like us to use. I remember my ankle starting to hurt and asked if I could stay in the tower for a bit. Thankfully, there was no one else using it, and both my dad and Rick told me to stay up there while they went to look for deer and to radio them if I needed anything. I got myself situated, and by this point, it was relatively dark out, which was a bit eerie if I'm being honest. Not long after they left, I happened to stand up to see if my ankle was better when I noticed what appeared to be a flashlight shining through the tree line. I figured one of them might have forgotten something, and so I stupidly called out to them by their names. "Dad? Rick? Is that you?" Almost immediately, I see the light turn off. At this point, I knew that it was obviously someone else and not my dad or Rick. It seemed as if whoever it was didn't want to make their presence known, which concerned me. Now, I thought that it could have been another hunter, but why would another hunter not want someone knowing they were here? I sort of hid in the tower, hoping they didn't see me, as I didn't know if this person was dangerous or not. I wanted to radio my dad to tell him, but I also didn't want to alert the person as to where I was. However, it wouldn't make sense if he could see me. It was practically still dark out here, or at least that was my logic. I waited in the tower for what felt like an eternity, praying to God that this person wouldn't come up here. Unfortunately though, that wasn't the case when I heard the sound of a foot hitting against one of the planks from the ladder of the tower. It's safe to say I nearly pissed myself hearing that, and while there was a slight possibility of it being my dad or Rick, the chances of that were slim. Minutes felt like hours as I heard this person climbing up the tower, and when they reached the top, I nearly screamed. It was still a little dark out, but I saw a man I had never seen before giving me this haunting grin. He did not at all look like a hunter or hiker, but rather someone you would sense was up to no good. In this raspy voice, he tells me that I should get down from this tower and to come with him. I couldn't think of anything to say other than no, and that's when he comes all the way up, reaching out to grab my hand. By this point, I tell him no once again, while also telling him to leave. Yes, I had my gun, but just the idea of using it on a person is horrifying. He just stood at the top of the tower staring at me before turning around and climbing back down. I'd say I felt a little better, but at the same time I didn't know where he went or if he would come back. 10 minutes later, I radio my dad telling him to please come back, to which he said they were on their way. The very second I radioed out, I hear the most gut-wrenching, horrifying scream not far from the tower. It was unlike anything I've ever heard, and that was when my dad yelled at me to get down from the tower and that we had to go. Rick began to scan the tree line with his rifle while my dad made sure I was okay. From there on, we ran back to the truck with my dad flooring it out of there. All the while, I'm telling him what happened while they were gone, and I try to give a description of the man. Being only 12, however, I couldn't give a good one as I couldn't remember and the fact that it was still dark. We made it back safely, but needless to say, I had a hard time sleeping that day. A week later, my mom and dad saw a chilling news report about a woman that went missing near the woods we went to and had since been found dead. My dad doesn't think it had anything to do with the scream we heard, but I thought the exact opposite. One thing I've learned from this, though, is that nothing good happens in the woods at night. This happened about 9 years ago while my girlfriend and I were going backpack hunting in British Columbia. Looking back, this sounds like a story from a horror movie, but I can assure you that this is 100% true. It's also a bit of a strange story, so buckle up. My girlfriend, who is now my wife, loved the outdoors, as did I, but not as much as she did. It was our 4th anniversary of being together, and we decided to go camping in the northern mountains of Canada. We've been through several parts of the US before, but decided that we'd give another country a try. We planned on staying in the mountains for about a week, and I packed enough supplies to last us until then. These mountains are massive, and you definitely didn't want to be left with no resources out here. I don't want to bore you with the small details, so I'll just jump right in. We had found this neat little spot to set up camp that was appropriate for the two of us, and even had a small ravine nearby for fishing. Our first 2 nights of camping went decently well, and it wasn't until the 3rd night where my girlfriend brought up the idea to do some midnight hunting. I was nearly on the verge of passing out after a long day, but she had seemed excited about it, and I wasn't gonna say no to the love of my life. In the end, I had to agree, and we changed into warm clothing and grabbed our gear. Now, we obviously weren't just gonna go wandering into the woods, so we decided to stay by our tent and light a fire to scare away any potential predators. We both had a pair of night vision binoculars so we could see better, even though it was likely we wouldn't find game at this time of night. Anyway, there we are, scanning the trees for any deer when I thought I heard rustling maybe about 20 feet away. I knew for sure it had to be an animal, as there were many creatures that come out at night, and it very well could have been a deer. We both grabbed our guns, trying to spot whatever made that noise, hoping to get a shot at it. We scanned the trees for a good minute or so, before I turned to my wife and see her stiff as a board. She's looking off at something into the trees, and when I ask her what's wrong, she doesn't reply. All she did was continue to stare in the direction of the woods, and when I looked in her direction, I saw it too. About maybe 20 yards away is a set of glowing eyes that were maybe about 10 feet off the ground. It was a little hard to hear, but we could hear heavy breathing coming from that direction, which gave us the chills. I also know it couldn't have been a bear, as the height difference didn't match that of any bear known to man. Trust me, I've been experienced with wildlife to know that what I was seeing was definitely no bear. Whatever it was massive, and I could tell you right now that this was no creature we've ever seen. Some way, somehow, I find the courage to tell my wife very calmly that we needed to get back inside the tent and to not make a sound. However, she doesn't respond and just looks at me with her wild eyes and face. I didn't want to draw more attention to this creature than we already did, so I direct my wife to the tent and we get inside not making a peep. All the while, I prayed that the fire didn't go out anytime soon, as that was probably the only thing preventing this creature from coming to us. 30 minutes felt like 30 hours as we both just laid there and heard multiple branches and trees snapping as this creature moved through the woods. It's safe to say that I didn't get a minute of sleep that night, and rightfully so. When morning came, my wife and I got out of our tent and found tracks of this supposed creature. They were tracks I had never seen from any living creature known to man, even after desperately trying to identify them. Till this day, I'm still unsure as to what it was we saw. I don't know if it was some unidentified creature. I don't know if it was Bigfoot. All we know is that there was indeed something tracking us out there, and that the woods have secrets that have yet to be uncovered. My name is Ben, and I've pretty much been an avid hunter for almost 20 years now. I've been doing this sport since I was 9, and I haven't stopped since then. This happened around a year ago when I went up to my brother's cabin in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in rural Pennsylvania. As most of you probably heard by now, the Appalachian Trail has hundreds of horror stories from multiple campers, hikers, and hunters. Many of them talking about what they've seen or heard while in the outdoors, and some even seeing stuff they can't even explain. Now, being familiar with the outdoors for most of my life, I can tell you that these stories aren't way off. There's definitely unexplainable mysteries in this part of the US that we don't know about, and one of them happened to me. It was the summer of 2023, and I was out elk hunting with my brother Josh in the middle of the night. With us on this night was his bloodhound named Jonathan, who would always sniff out animals to sort of help us locate game. It was around 7 p.m. and there was barely any light left. My brother and I began searching the trees for any movement with night vision, hoping to get something. If there was anything out there, we'd definitely pick it up on our radar and see it. My brother was actually a lot more professional with hunting than I was, and even brought his equipment with him too. After not seeing anything for a few hours, my brother tells me to take apart my rifle and pack it up to head back and to carry a few things. As I was picking up my hunting bag, I look at Jonathan, the bloodhound, and notice he appeared to be fixated on something in the distance. In a sort of playful tone, I say, "What is it, boy? You see anything?" However, it was then where he let out a single bark that echoed across the woods, letting us know that there was indeed something out there. My brother and I grab our guns and use our night vision to try and see what it was. A few seconds later, we finally spot what the dog was barking at, but it was not at all an animal, but rather a person. My brother and I sort of look at each other in confusion as to what the hell someone was doing this far out into the woods. Mind you, his cabin is the only one for miles, and it was rare to see outsiders this deep into the woods. At one point, he was considering to tell them that this was private property, but him and I just sort of watched them for the time being. I'd say we watched this person for a good few minutes before we hear them say something that scared the piss out of us. Based on the tone, it sounded like a female, but that's not being confirmed nor denied. I remember my brother whispering an "oh shit" before grabbing his gear and running away from whoever that was. I obviously wasn't far behind him, and we made it back to his cabin safely. My brother had this pale white face that clearly made him terrified. He thankfully took the time to compose himself and told me that he thought that it had to be a skinwalker of some kind. I will say, hearing him, a grown man who is basically one with nature, say that gave me the chills. I've heard of skinwalkers before, and while I have doubts believing they exist, I'm not sure what to believe. My name is Jack. I'm currently 20 years old and have been an experienced hunter throughout my life. This past winter, I had been visiting with my best friend Dan on his family's farm in western Colorado for a hunting trip. He was my best friend ever since the beginning of high school, so letting me come up to live with him for a bit was very thoughtful. With me on this trip was my girlfriend Gabby, who has never actually been hunting or camping before. She was understandably nervous, but we made sure to watch out for her. Colorado is a very rural state, so we do have to watch out for predators or any people for that matter. Dan's told me stories about how mountain lions would occasionally sneak up on him, only for him to see it right before it was about to attack. Those were definitely scary times for Dan, but what we were about to experience was much more horrific. It was sometime in December where Dan was showing us this neat little trail he had found to get to a clearing in the woods. It was a cool spot for hunting, and so we set up camp and decided to scope out the area. By this point, it was pretty dark out and we were freezing our asses off. Dan, being the handy guy he was, builds us a fire to keep us warm while Gabby and I look for elk. Gabby said that she's gonna go a bit further into the woods and radio us if she finds anything. I tell her not to go too far and to use the campfire to know where we were. Call me an ass for letting her go alone. I don't care. I wanted her to have the full hunting experience. Gabby had been gone for about 20 minutes and Dan and I are just sitting in our chairs by the fire. As he was babbling on about some coworker of his, we hear Gabby scream at the top of her lungs. I just couldn't believe how loud she was screaming. It was actually insane. Dan and I immediately get up and grab our lights and Glocks to see Gabby running out of the trees. We both comfort her as she went on about how she saw something huge walking around her and making a terrible sound. I told her it could have been a coyote or maybe a mountain lion. We assured her that we would grow the fire more to scare away any predators and to not go back out. This seemed to comfort her, and after a while she went to sleep. Dan and I are now outside by the fire just talking quietly and watching the fire when he gets up to go take a leak. It was just me by myself at the fire when, off to my right, I hear a loud crunch. "What the hell was that? That is big," he said. I know, it could be a big cat. Better get your .44. He returned with his gun and lighter fluid to grow the fire even more. By this point, we had the fire pretty enormous, and that's when we hear more movement from the trees. Because of the now glowing fire, we saw for a brief second what almost appeared to be a gorilla-sized figure disappear into the trees. Somehow, this commotion didn't wake up Gabby, to my surprise. We're both just frozen, not knowing what to think, and I tell him that we need to snap out of it and get back in the tents. We do just that, and we didn't hear anything the whole night. The fire stayed lit for hours until the sun finally came up. Dan and I only got maybe an hour of sleep and were the first ones up. However, we didn't see any tracks of whatever this thing could have been. It looked like a large man, but what we saw was definitely no man. I guess we'll never know, and I'm not sure we want to.